Welcome, everyone, and aloha. Welcome to Commit to Keiki's third talk story. This afternoon, we're very pleased to have with us Lieutenant Governor and gubernatorial candidate Josh Green. For those of you that don't know, Commit to Keiki is a nonpartisan education initiative in partnership with Early Childhood Action Strategy partners, businesses, early learning advocates for mental health, family violence, childcare, and early learning. Our primary goal is to be a resource to the gubernatorial candidates and our next governor to ensure that investments are made that support young children and families. Today we have with us Dr. Sulma Gandhi, Hawaii Health Program Officer of the Stigma Foundation and member of the Commit to Keiki Steering Committee, who will be our moderator this afternoon. Let me go over a couple of quick points about how this talk story will work. It's intended to be a conversation with the candidate. We'd like to hear from Josh how he intends to prioritize programs for Hawaii's young children and families. Our moderator will kick things off with some questions, and then we'd like to open it up to question and answer for our audience. Commit to Keiki Steering Committee members will have an opportunity to come off mute and on screen to ask their questions. Others in the audience, please send your questions via the chat function. Hopefully we can get to all of them during this hour-long session. Until we get to the Q&A, we ask that you all please leave your videos turned off so that we can spotlight the speakers. This forum is being recorded and will be made publicly available on Alelo. This forum is also being live streamed on Facebook. Thank you all very much for joining in what is sure to be an informative and exciting discussion. Soma, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Carrie. Welcome, Josh. As Carrie mentioned, my name is Sulma Gandhi, and I am the Hawaii Health Program Officer for the Stigma Foundation. Several years ago, we, the Stigma Foundation, partnered and invested in an effort in California, the Choose Children campaign, which resulted in California's new governor committing significant state investment in early childhood health, safety, and learning. We are excited to embark on something similar in Hawaii, Commit to Keiki. The result in California has had a substantial impact on children and families. We believe the same can and should happen here in Hawaii. So without any further delay, it is my pleasure to introduce you to Lieutenant Governor Josh Green. Josh Green started caring for local families as a doctor in a small clinic on the Big Island more than 20 years ago. He served in the State House and the State Senate from 2004 to 2018. Helping to provide healthcare for every child in Hawaii, more resources to treat addiction, and insurance coverage for kids with autism. Since becoming Hawaii's Lieutenant Governor in 2018, Josh helped build kauhale communities and the H4 clinic to provide housing and care for those in need. And when a measles epidemic hit Samoa in 2019, Josh led a team of doctors and nurses from Hawaii, and within 24 hours, they vaccinated 37,000 people and protected Samoa's children. Just a few months later, when COVID hit, Josh led the largest healthcare response in the state's history, pulling Hawaii together to vaccinate over 1 million people. Josh and his wife, Jamie, share the values of Hawaii: family and community, diversity, and a responsibility to future generations. Today, Josh continues to work as an emergency room doctor on weekends, caring for local families as he has for over 20 years. Welcome, Lieutenant Governor Green. Before we begin, I share with you an intimate knowledge of rural healthcare and our connection to Hawaii Island. I've lived on the east side for over 2 decades, raising children, and have primarily served in the health and human services field. I'm thrilled to welcome you here today. So first, tell us a little bit about yourself and why you are interested in running for governor.
Thank you, Selma. Thank you for Commit to Keiki's time. It's really appreciated. We share almost every value that I can imagine. So why am I running for governor? I worry deeply about people who struggle and suffer. And that's where I've been for more than 2 decades here in my other profession as a doctor. I really am concerned that a lot of people suffer, they suffer traumas. And that's the space that I came from. When I ran for office the first time, and I didn't have any special expectation that I would end up winning, so I'm trying to make a point back in 2004 that families in Kau on the Big Island, where I was the doctor for the National Health Corps, they had no access, all the families, and therefore the children had no access to trauma services, to behavioral health services, so no access to drug treatment or behavioral health and mental illness services, and very limited access to general safety net in Kau, a lot of poverty. So to be a doctor that had transplanted my life to the Big Island and to see the way those 8,000 individuals who I was caring for struggled, that was why I got into office. I saw 2 children suffer tragic injuries, 2 one-year-olds, one lived and one did not live, as a result of their families having severe challenges with methamphetamine addiction. And that was the impetus for me to run. Thank God that one child lived. And then after getting selected into the House of Representatives and then subsequently the Senate, I've essentially made all of my work, I've insisted all of my work focus on children and healthcare at its core. And that's why I'm running for governor now, because we need leaders that we can trust, that care about people, but who have actual experience dealing with some of these crises. And I hope that my experience, I wouldn't say resume, just my experience informs the way I would be as a governor if people choose me. But when I say that's what we've worked on, it is really what we worked on. Access to universal health care for our Keiki, taking a look at those children who were suffering on the autism spectrum and not getting any care, changing the laws so that everyone got trauma services no matter where they were or how poor they might be. So that is kind of an underpinning of what I believe that you guys are focused on, though there's much more, because that doesn't touch yet on early learning, and it may not touch on some of the other priorities after early education. But as a doctor, I look at things through the health lens. As lieutenant governor, I do the same, whether it's now for homeless individuals or people struggling with other challenges. And as governor, that's exactly where I'll put my focus. So my administration will heavily invest in Hawaii's future, mostly to ensure that Keiki receive care, nutrition, and support from a trauma-free life, to avoid a trauma life. The last thing I would share with you is I was very lucky. So when I was born, I didn't meet any of my developmental milestones for about 21 months. And it turned out that I didn't have developmental disability, but what I had was profound deafness. And so I was very fortunate that they were able to discover that was the problem. And through surgical interventions, I did have my hearing restored. So I was able to get great care and meet developmental milestones and catch up over the course of 6, 8, 10 years. But so many people don't. And so Jamie and I are committed to making sure that children's development is at the core of what we do, because ultimately I would have never had the opportunities to do anything had I not had that opportunity. And it's not lost on me that everyone should have those opportunities.
I appreciate how you weaved in some personal stories and what has been a calling from the community for you that's driven you. So I am wondering, as you know, Commit to Keiki has 3 priorities that we believe are critical for healthy early child development. They are access to affordable childcare and early childhood programs. Our second platform is access to family violence prevention and intervention programs and services. And our third focus area is access to early childhood and ohana mental health supports. My questions are about how your administration will support increasing access. You talked a lot about access in your earlier statement about what's driving you. So I'm wondering about increasing access in each of these priority areas. So let's start with a question for access to affordable and quality childcare and early learning. We recently shared with you and your campaign a statewide poll that we conducted that asked voters a series of questions about issues of importance to them and what they believe our next governor should address when it comes to our youngest children and our ohana. Our research revealed that 74.5%, three-quarters of all islands voters believe our next governor must invest more to create a series of high-quality, publicly funded, community-based childcare and early learning programs. My question for you, how will your administration support increasing access to affordable and quality childcare and early learning programs?
So I'm so glad that that's where our society is. It's a great relief that we're not struggling to convince people any longer that the best investment we can make is in our children and in their developmental stages. Though people do develop, this is now me as the physician, they develop for many years. We develop for a lifetime, but most of our development, our fundamental development occurs for say age 8 or 10. So in those early years, much more investment has to be made. And I will tell you this. So first of all, we should finally commit to paid family leave. And so I'm eager to sign that into law, and we'll make a big push of it. I don't know that the legislature will be up to that this year. They seem to be focusing more on wages, as it turns out this year, as a progressive issue, which I'm glad they're focusing on that. But it's refreshing to know that Hawaii's Ohana is really focusing on children. The truth is that, number one, if you neglect a child early, you'll never get them back, period. You just won't. Almost all of the traumas that we suffer in early childhood, though some people can pull out of that very difficult spiral, persist into adolescence and then into adulthood. They don't get educated, they leave school early, and then the likelihood of having a life where they themselves inflict trauma on the next generation it's unstoppable, and have been incarcerated, many problems. So we know that there's a 7-to-1 or better return on investment if we care for kids. That's the way we convince the bean counters and the economists, and maybe the conservatives amongst us, of which there are a couple left in Hawaii, not too many, thank goodness. But the thinkers that focus on childhood development need to be funded. They have to actually have the ability to create and put those positions into place. One thing we have to do is we're going to have to rebuild much of the health and social safety net, because needless to say, when you go through a pandemic like we did, I can't believe it's taken me this long to even mention the pandemic. It usually starts a lot sooner in every Zoom call.
It's coming.
Those resources are often the first to go. And so reinvestment and a total investment in pre-K is critical. Quality healthcare is central to everything I believe in. And so a large scale initiative to have individuals who work in healthcare and the social services has to be instituted where we repay all of their debt, their training debt, so that they can actually afford to live in Hawaii and serve in places like Ka'u, where you will make a lot less money, but you may have much more need, ironically. That's there's a perverse situation there where the need is greatest. Sometimes the access to care is the least. We know that to be true of Big Island. There's a lot more that goes into our commitment to safe and secure development than just healthcare and social services. There's nutrition. So enacting universal pre-K, which often comes with it access to meals, and those meals reduce trauma on poor families. It's a big deal. And then, as you can imagine, comprehensive screening and access to the care that I was very fortunate to get just before age 2, which basically illuminated what my developmental problems were. That has to be there too. So that's where I would start. And the Department of Health and Human Services have to actually work together. They have very large budgets, but are often siloed. And unfortunately, it creates a disconnect, and we waste a lot of resources when we could actually be investing them in the field. And I'm a big be in the field guy. That's why I'm still practicing medicine.
Yeah, I appreciate you talked a little bit about the things that I heard were the ways that you would address this is by a commitment and work towards family leave, knowing and understanding that the return on investment is really good and high and good for not only the individual child, but for the families. If we invest in children, you said 7-to-1. We want to think about, you're talking about rebuilding the health and safety net. You talked about pre-K, you brought up workforce, also nutrition, and really thinking about how do we work more collaboratively together without the silos. I'm going to move into my next question, which is around the pandemic. So you know firsthand that COVID has left an indelible mark on Hawaii. Nearly 244,000 people have contracted COVID, and sadly, 1,370 have succumbed to the virus. COVID has impacted families across the islands and all businesses in immeasurable ways. One area has been in mental health. In fact, an overwhelming number of respondents, 82.5% from our polls, stated that it is important for our next governor to prioritize programs that address mental health needs for families and young children in the next budget. How will your administration increase mental health supports for our youngest Keiki and their families?
Perfect question. Well, okay, so allow me to work in my wheelhouse for a moment here. Trained as a family physician, I'm so aware of before the COVID pandemic, how we were already struggling to provide care for those in need with mental illness challenges. Okay, it was about 20% of the population at any given time was struggling very severely, and the number is much higher amongst those who are Alice families because they don't get any care and they don't have any extra money for co-pays, don't have any extra time away from their second or third jobs to go and even be seen and therefore counted. So a lot of this comes back to preparing a society that's better economically suited to survive in Hawaii, first off. Second, absolutely mental health care has to be considered primary care. That's been a mistake that every state has made for decade upon decade. Mental health care, behavioral health care, which means mental health care plus addiction, which has soared because self-medication has soared during COVID and during crisis, has to be considered primary care. And if it's considered primary care, then all of our programs, which are already built for primary care, immediately become activated for those who are in need of referrals. That also means, though, that we have to recruit and develop many more primary healthcare givers, PCPs, social workers, psychologists, counselors, marriage and family therapists, and so on. All of those are primary healthcare disciplines which should be fully funded and reimbursed for care in the community. Nurse practitioners, PAs, those are the people that are the backbone of the healthcare system, which actually are, to a much greater degree, accessible in all of our vulnerable populations. People that are really not accessible historically are guys like me, unless you work in the National Health Corps like I did, because physicians will tend to gravitate towards hospitals or more affluent communities where they can survive with a modern Western medical practice. So as a physician governor, I'm completely in touch with that. And I intend to expand the primary care health base exponentially in our state. Again, with loan repayment to recruit doctors, nurses, psychologists, counselors, social workers from all across the country. In fact, I will personally go to other states across the globe, across our country, and ask them to come and serve in Hawaii where we have need, which will be a pretty dynamic ask because I'm actually a physician, right? So that's one of our plans. But these are the things that you have to do. You build out the community health center system more vibrantly. For example, I don't know if people know this, but the Bay Clinic on Big Island, which is now partnered with the West Hawaii Community Health Center, which I was fortunate enough to co-found back in 2004, I think. Bay Clinic started out as a WIC center, women and children's access to nutrition, essentially, right? Vaccinations, advocacy. That's what it was before it was even a community health center, which now takes care of tens of thousands of people. And our community health center system can continue to be more vibrant. So we continue to expand that. I think it should be partnered with those economic programs which get people into good jobs. That would help a lot too, because we should really help people on both sides, both their healthcare and their economic health. But that's what I'll do as governor. It really depends on what people's political will is. Fortunately, healthcare touches everyone. And as we've seen post-pandemic with the enormous surge in need, about doubled, we have no choice but to do this. We also had to build an extra state hospital for those who are really struggling. Mm-hmm. You see us building Kauhale, which are homeless villages for people that have slipped even below the traditional poverty level and have gone all the way into a destitute state. So that's how I will approach it. I really see us as a state that can lead in this way because we've been committed to health for a long time. Interestingly, we have the distinction of being the healthiest state in the country, which means we live longer than any other community, and no one else even rivals us as far as covering individuals with healthcare. However, those who are in poverty or those who are of Hawaiian descent have very large disparities, and that has to be remedied.
So the points I'm hearing you bring up have to do with that access aspect. You brought up the Alice populations, where the health outcome disparities are lying. I'm hearing some of the solutions you're thinking about relate to elevating mental health as primary care. And you spoke a lot about workforce. You spoke about it earlier in our conversation, and you're still speaking about it now in terms of what we need to do for serving our communities. And then you linked it to community health centers and the access that they have as well, and the needs that our communities have for them. I'm going to ask you another question before we start turning it over to our audience to ask their own questions. More than 85% of voters polled felt that our next governor should prioritize family violence prevention and intervention programs. Given what you know about family violence, such as child abuse, neglect, and intimate partner violence, how will your administration increase access to family support programs?
Thank you again for that. Let me tell you a little story about my upbringing. So my aunt, Stephanie, who's a wonderful woman, 12 years older than me, so not a large gap. She was more like an older sister than an aunt. She had a very tough go. She was the youngest child on my mom's side. She fell in with men, even though she's very smart, is very smart, went to Carnegie Mellon, a thoughtful student, started her career, did well, but she was abused. She was badly beaten by first the boyfriends that I knew when she was 20 years old and I was 8. We'd have fun times together. He seemed like a great guy. And then I found out later she was the victim of domestic violence in the worst ways, until finally my uncle rescued her from her relationship and brought her back into our home and family circle. Years later, and this was all created because there was trauma at home. Years later, she married a gentleman who was a police officer who abused her, and it led to her alcoholism. My aunt has 6 daughters, now 5, one has passed, and 4 of those daughters came from the first relationship. Her last 2 daughters, her youngest, came from a very wonderful man where she finally was able to marry and turn the corner on domestic violence. I observed this the entirety of my life. And this wonderful woman, my Aunt Steph, who is still dear to me, now she's 64 years old, she finally broke the cycle. But even in a family with as many resources as we had, physicians, affluent lawyers, everyone was educated, mostly in the Ivy League, just incredibly, she still struggled with these realities. And she had every advantage, which tells you, of course, that every individual who has less advantage or less opportunity has even more vulnerability, whether they have poverty issues to deal with or less education or any number of challenges. But my Aunt Steph went through these things. And so in that experience, or through that experience, I see that you have to have a totally different perspective. And that is that everyone is vulnerable. And therefore, everyone should have access to services when they need them. As a physician, once I was caring for a woman who was beaten near to death, and she came in, we couldn't recognize who she was, even though it was a very small community down in the southern part of Big Island. Only after 2 days were we able to find out who she actually was, and she lived. It was like the 3rd or 4th time we had seen her in the emergency department, and each time she had gone back because she really had no other option. Finally, we were able to extract her from that life. And I will tell you, if I could be very blunt, the only reason she didn't go back to that guy was because he was beaten to hell by the local guys in Ka'u when they finally realized that she almost died. And these were some of the guys in her community that she'd gone to high school with. And so those experiences are indelibly burned into my brain as a physician and as a nephew. What will I do? I will make sure that we actually bring not just government resources, but philanthropic resources to bear across the spectrum. Instead of just using our philanthropic resources to do economic development and some of the wonderful things that people would like to invest in Hawaii, I'm also going to ask those individuals who are knocking at my door as I look to become governor to also invest in the social aspects of Hawaii, because though it is paradise for many, for those who are really struggling, it can be a living hell. So that is the experience I've had. Being a clinician helps in this particular case. And so that is really where I've been at. But shelters have to be more supported, especially shelters that are specific to women who have need. And they have to be very carefully crafted so that there can be a lot of privacy, because we're in such a small community, especially on the neighbor islands, but Oahu also, that it's difficult for people to find a safe space. Mm-hmm. And that requires actually more investment than usual, because we don't have the luxury of getting someone to a safe place much further away. And even when you do emerge from that dangerous time, you're right back in the thick of it very quickly here in Hawaii. So these are some of the lessons I've learned. A lot of these answers, of course, do come down to a commitment to fund and commitment to serve and support. But I have served on several boards, particularly boards that are focused on sex assault and other programs in support of children. Those would be the two areas I've tried to focus on.
Thank you for those stories. And you're highlighting how it really takes a community to create a safe environment for our families. I have one last question, and then we're going to bring Carrie back on to help our audience ask some questions as well. So, you know, it's been publicized that some of your top priorities as governor include affordable housing, homelessness, and cost of living. We're wondering, where does early childhood development fall on your list of priorities? What will your administration do to ensure that early childhood development is a priority?
Yes.
This gets back to budget, right? So, you know, Senator Biden, now President Biden, talked about, you show me your budget and then I'll tell you what your values are, because that's what it reflects. So that's a little bit about what this question is about.
Yes. Well, I was lucky to serve as the chairperson of the Human Services Committee after serving as the chairperson of the Health Committee for many years. And so I have great familiarity with exactly what our commitment can be for those who are in need. What I would say is this: you should really be weaving in childhood development, childhood safety, really our commitment to Keiki, into everything that we do. There is an understanding now, and I think it was at the IVAT conference earlier this week, that if we have a commitment to trauma-related policy in all of our policy, then we don't simply leave everyone out to dry if one single line item doesn't make it through, which is a precarious situation to be in. If year after year, legislative cycle after legislative cycle, you have to establish priorities in that way. Much better to have a full commitment at the level of fundamentals. In other words, people wonder, why do I keep talking about affordable housing? Well, the moment you have affordable housing, you can decrease by somewhere between $600 and $1,200 the amount a family has to pay to live here in Hawaii. And the difference of having that extra $600 to $1,200 may mean the ability to afford education for their 2.5-year-old. It may mean the ability to have one less job, which would take the mom or dad away from their 2-year-old or 3-year-old every evening of the week. And I come back to that. So it's a fundamental commitment to change society in a way that we actually can lovingly raise our children. Beyond that, however, there are obviously challenges. Not every family, even if they are able to afford housing, can get by without some extra help. And so fully funding the Department of Health and Human Services will always be a commitment. That would be the last thing that I would ever cut. And actually, I would much prefer to expand us into the space where everyone, as kind of a fundamental right, has pre-K education available to their children. It's just one more way to get good touches on our children. The way I was raised, when I was a 2-year-old, right, my hearing's restored. At 2.5, my parents put me into Montessori school, which meant that for 8 hours a day, I had public pre-K available to me, essentially, and that's the way they ran it in Pittsburgh. And in addition to that, I had, 2 parents that were pretty committed, and one of them was able to be with me at home all the other time. It was only because of our economic viability that they were able to do all those things. And so solving the fundamentals is actually, I think, the better approach, though that will take a lot of time. And in the meanwhile, we will continue to do what is necessary to patch crises. And I would much rather, avert crises, but we'll patch them when we need to. And that means having a lot of case managers, a lot of people who are community health workers that can go to the home, doing house calls, doing check-ins on people, especially if they've gone through crises, if someone's been incarcerated in the family, and we therefore know that the likelihood of violence and addiction is so much higher in the subsequent years. Those are the kind of services that can't be cut. I do think that we should take advantage of what's likely to be an economic boom post-COVID and invest in these structures instead of taking the cheap way out, and that's just throwing money at popular shiny objects like high rises and tax credits here or there. It would probably be a lot better to invest in our people and let them build their own economic security. Then they won't need these.
Thank you. Thank you, Josh. I've enjoyed having this conversation with you. We're going to turn it over now to Carrie to share some questions from our audience.
Great. Thanks, Soma, and thank you, Josh. Really appreciate hearing how you think about early childhood development so holistically. And what I'd like to do now, please ask the steering committee members to come off or come on video, please. And then Heidi, if you can switch the present into gallery. That'd be great, thank you. Okay, and then I will hand it over to the steering committee members to begin our question and answer. And then I also have two coming from participants as well.
Carrie, if I may,
I'll start. Yeah,
I'll
go
try
ahead,
to be a
Josh.
little more succinct in my answers now that we've gotten to kind of lay down the foundation in case there's a lot of questions. But if you want me to elaborate, if I've given too short an answer, then please tell me.
Okay, great. I will actually start with a question that came from those that are listening in. And this is from Eunice Cohen. And she says, in order to provide an affordable and quality early childhood education program for our Keiki in community, we need to make sure to build a quality teaching staff as well. Currently, our early childhood education teaching staff, administrative staff are not getting paid well. And this is causing an issue to many preschools who can't retain their quality staff for their program. Providing affordable early childhood education programs shouldn't demand our ECE staff to endure their low wage. Do you have a plan to ensure that ECE staff's wages will be increased by providing state aid or funding as needed? Thank you, Eunice.
Thank you. That's a great question, right? That kind of underscores one of the fundamental problems, which is the professions that are the most caring and thoughtful in our society are often the least adequately paid, like teachers who are teaching elementary schools or teachers that are helping individuals that are struggling through severe learning disabilities. So many of these programs. So the answer is yes. It's again twofold. One thing I believe we need to do is give people an access to education themselves, which doesn't cost anything if they go through the community college program or into the higher education program through grants. So disciplines that are considered shortage disciplines or essential disciplines for society, I think people should have an opportunity through service to have all of their debt forgiven. It's an incredibly smart investment because for every individual that you get into that field, you are saving millions and millions and millions of dollars downstream where people just didn't get service or care or education. So that's one thing. The other thing is my team is already looking at some pretty robust programs to do workforce housing for those individuals, again, in disciplines that are difficult to attract professionals. And it is not surprising to me at all that it's difficult to get these services in some hard to reach areas where housing costs $700,000, $800,000, $1.2 million, and there's still a need. Areas like West Hawaii, classic example. We often don't deliver any services for long stretches of time because we just have too few professionals to take care of all their I was going to say patients, but really the children in their community. So yes, a loan program, loan forgiveness was the first thing to do. Also, increments in educational pay, I believe, have to be fixed in public education. That's a little bit broader than the question we're addressing today, although from my standpoint, early learning and early education is public education for the most part. And so we should support that. And then supporting the infrastructure too in those programs so that people who start their own schools, programs, they're not bearing the full load of that infrastructure. That's a lot of people that have decided to go into the field, but they really carry too much of the burden to start the program themselves. So all those things are where I would start. I would try to be as generous as I can with all educators, especially early childhood educators.
Great, thank you, Josh. Steering committee members.
Hi, Josh. This is Joanne.
Hey, Joanne.
I am actively involved with the Association for Infant Mental Health here in Hawaii, right? And, one of our goals is to increase pediatric mental health services in community health centers. And including not only the treatment level, but really the prevention and kapuna level kind of community help for helping families, who have challenges with their keiki. Can you talk a little bit more about how you see the integration of these two pieces, in community health settings or other pediatric settings?
Yes, obviously very sophisticated questions. It's good to see you again, Joanne. So first and foremost, the mechanism by which we can help deal with this challenge is by having community health worker programs, well-funded, built out of the community, specifically with kupuna, interestingly. When you use members of a community, and that's the community health worker model, when you bring those health workers from their own community and have them work in their community, first of all, the outcomes are much better because the familiarity with culture and family in that community, which doesn't even vary across different, sections of our beautiful state, means for a lot more effective care. And that also sometimes crosses ethnic bounds. So for instance, if you have a community that's heavily Micronesian, for example, but your community health workers that are connected to the community health center are the elders there and some of the young people that want to go into healthcare, you hire them as community health workers with grants and with funds that go naturally to the community health center system, you get a great improvement in outcomes in those communities. So that's one thing. You have less hospitalizations, you have less loss of life to trauma, which is a very big deal for people under age 25. It's probably the #1 cause of death right now is still trauma. So all of those are the reasons you do it that way. Also, by funding the community health centers, we do get pretty good return because we have federal government support based on our community health center network. The PPS rate is robust, and that's why I was suggesting that you want to fold all of mental health care into that, because the reason, for instance, that Maui cut their adolescent psych program was because it didn't pay anything, and they were losing money off of it. And it's not, you can't even have the pejorative of it being a lost leader and you bring people in. It's too horrible to fathom that that's how patients come to the hospital. So what it really meant is they ended up cutting the program that was least economically viable. And so then therefore all of the children that needed behavioral health support, a lot of times it was suicide prevention or drug treatment, had to get transferred to Oahu where they were away from their closest loved ones and they were scared. So that has to be fixed. You basically want to invert that pyramid so that your primary care base is there for people with mental health care. And the only way to make it affordable, because you can't hire enough child psychiatrists, this will not work.
Right.
You have to share child psychiatrists between 3 or 4 centers probably, but you can have a lot of community health workers that have the right psychological health training or drug treatment training to be there. And they're also nice jobs, and they are very family oriented jobs, which usually suits the community that needs them.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Next question from Megan.
Aloha, thanks so much for your time today. Seagull Schools is an early education provider, and we have 5 sites around the island. And one of our struggles is to meet our mission to keep prices as low as possible for working families. So my question is really around affordability and access to early education. What would your administration do to ensure that Hawaii's families have affordable early education options as the state continues its important rollout of the public pre-K?
I really think it comes down to funding it. And the question there will be, where do we choose to get our revenues if we're going to augment our revenues? You have 2 options. We have increased tax base. Well, maybe we have 3. We have a continued commitment to what some people is over tourism, which will bring revenue in. And then finally, a new tax base altogether, which we're talking about a sustainability tax or an impact fee tax, green fee, if you will, coming into the state that gets devoted to services that otherwise all of our people need but don't get. I really think you just have to bite the bullet and pay for education, and you got to pay from about age 2.5 to about 20 instead of just paying for education from about 5 to 19. And if you do those things, meaning you give people community college on the back end and you give them pre-K up front, you're fine. I'm completely open to increasing people's tax breaks if they want or need them from the private sector, if they're providing services that are in the public benefit. I have no problem with that. I used to be much more prudish about it. I hope this isn't too controversial. But whether it's a church-based program, which people might choose, or a nonprofit-based program, which I love, that's my personal priority normally, or a public school program, which is straight out of the playbook for, kind of rank and file good public education. I'm open to any of those things because I think that what has happened in Hawaii is we have a pretty robust public sector. We artificially suppress middle-class salaries, which means that everyone's short by about this much all the time. And that means that the wealth that has come to Hawaii some of it has to be taken and invested in that delta. And that delta is really the difference between a family being able to get their second kid into pre-K or not. And therefore, if they do, they can maybe even earn a few extra dollars. We have a workforce shortage after all. Everyone can work if they want to, but not if they have to care for their second or third child. It just will not work easily. So that's my approach, but to be very permissive about tax breaks and private investment in and as a part of public education.
Great, thank you. Up next is a question from Alice Luck, and then I will ask a question from Justina Azevedo Cross. So Alice asks, what is the role of stigma in the 3 priorities of Commit to Keiki in access and service provision? What strategies are called for to combat that stigma?
That is an awesome question. Okay, so when we were dealing with the HIV/AIDS crisis in the mid 80s and the 90s, the stigma was extraordinary because no one wanted to come and get care because they were afraid of the homophobic reaction across America. And that left people like my uncles, many of whom actually were gay, unable to go and get care. They're professionals. One went to Harvard for his medical degree. Another was a concert musician. And the stigma was so great to deal with the fact that they had HIV/AIDS that they wouldn't go get care, or they had to relocate far away from where they had gotten care initially. So stigma has driven us away from getting good care for people. How did we beat that? We destigmatized HIV and we normalized people's understanding of it. And then we went through the whole process of destigmatizing homosexuality so people weren't discriminated against, and that has been a long process, and fortunately a lot better, I think, than it has been. It's not perfect yet. Now, of course, the transgender community is dealing with it, and we still see it extraordinarily with individuals who have been beaten or who are addicted. And honestly, America and our communities are going to have to get over it because pretty much all of us have a loved one in our family or a first-degree relative quite quickly or friend that is either an addict or has other significant challenges in life. And so we have to destigmatize mental illness because it's so common, even now more than ever, that we make it just a standard understanding that we've all gone through this. And so when you normalize that and you kind of make things just more, I don't want to say accessible, but more common, when you understand that these are things that are common in families, then the stigma falls away. I did have a niece who I should say a cousin when she was like a niece because she was younger. Her mental illness became a large stigma for her. She took her life. This was about 2 years before the COVID pandemic broke out. She did not seek care until too late. And she didn't want to share with us what she was wrestling, which was, though she was educated and making 6 figures, she was first dealing with mental illness and she shifted to major drug use. But she couldn't share that stigma with us, in spite of the fact that her uncle had also taken his own life. And so it happens all the time. It happens all the time. And people don't want to talk about it because there's such a sense of shame. But when we talk about it in the open, which is what we ultimately did with HIV/AIDS and homosexuality, then people understand that we all struggle with some of these challenges at one time or another in our life. And then we're able to kind of move forward as a society. Some societies have not gotten it together. There's a lot of different countries that are not doing a very good job at this, and they're going to struggle worse than you can imagine. Hawaii should be really at the tip of the spear when it comes to being open. We are one of our greatest gifts, of course, is our diversity, and also our complete and I think our extended understanding and tolerance of different ideology and sexual preference, and now the latest challenge when people struggle with trauma. And so we have to treat trauma like those other challenges, which are very hard things to deal with when people don't understand them.
Great. Thank you, Josh. I appreciate your comments about normalizing these topics so that we all can speak about them more candidly in trusted spaces. So thank you. The next question is from Justina Azevedo Cross from the Hawaii Community Foundation. Thank you for talking about stronger collaboration between Department of Human Services and Department of Health for better outcomes for our Keiki. What ideas do you have to create more collaboration and to leverage resources amongst our public agencies? I'd also like to add Executive Office of Early Learning and Department of Ed, as they all touch our youngest, Keiki.
They do. That's actually a concrete plan that we've already begun to develop, although we're careful not to create too much bachi before this primary is over. But we are planning. I mean, I want our first year to be a dynamic one if I'm chosen as governor. So what our current plan is to actually kind of draw a large circle around 2 or 3 different subsections of the cabinet. As you know, there are basically 18 cabinet positions and departments, and they each have their deputies and then their extensive support, bureaucracy, call it what you will. Department of Human Services, Health, and Education are one. They're one. And frankly, I would actually add housing, especially housing for those who are facing economic challenges, because we know, based on the data, based on our experience as professionals, that these challenges go hand in hand. If people are evicted, we had an extraordinary speaker on eviction just a couple days ago over at UH, a national leader in the discipline, and he described, he won the Pulitzer Prize actually for this work, it's called Evicted. He described the nature of trauma and how people struggle and suffer when they're evicted, and it was completely driven by 2 things. One was understandable, poverty, right? And this guy is the foremost thinker on the matter. The second one, very ironically, was people who had children. They were more likely to be evicted, more likely. And so putting together these departments that understand how housing, care for our Keiki and who are often our most vulnerable people, and other essential services come together, that's more important. So I expect to have cabinet meetings which are really differently driven. So I'm not going to be so worried about putting the military affairs guys in the space all the time of the human services folks, and then everyone going off to their own universe again. I would rather see them spend a lot more time in affinity groups, and I will be there with those affinity groups, particularly this one, because it's my own personal area of expertise.
Thank you, Josh. We have at least 4 more questions before the top of the hour here. So next up, Bob Peters.
Thank you, Lieutenant Green, Lieutenant Governor Green, for sharing your thoughts today. They're really encouraging to hear. I basically was going to ask Justina's question, so I won't ask it again. But something that builds a little bit off that. You talked about the importance of integrating child well-being in all the focus areas that you will be working toward. I'm wondering, how will you ensure that early learning and young children do not get lost in those focus areas as one of a collective group and lose their priority importance in your administration?
Sure, that's great. I think they have to be prioritized, because if we fail with early learning and childhood development, we fail long-term in every other area. So what I think you have to do is you have to make sure that at for instance, the superintendent level of schools, that person or that group of people that run the schools have a total and full commitment to early learning, without a doubt. And if I don't have a superintendent committed to that out of the gate, then we'll have to switch superintendents. I mean, it's really that simple. Overall, this investment in our community is so important that at the beginning and end of every day, we have to ask ourselves, are our kids safe? It really comes down to that. And are our kids getting educated? The tricky part about this is, and this is why we need very strong advocates all the day and night is because we don't see the results for a long time. And you get a new governor every damn 4 years or 8. And it takes 15 or 20 years to know whether society has lived up to its commitment to children. So I think that you will have to help me understand who the best people are in this area to make sure we retain them. You'll have to help me understand where we have gaps, where for years you've been focused on this and maybe government has just failed to really step up. And then finally, I mean, we haven't really had a full economic commitment to the question. I think that is in many ways fundamental in all ways. I will be bringing other allied professions to bear on this question. And when I say that, I mean, I intend to bring some of our best pediatricians into the field and to make sure that we are, through their eyes, what they see in the children that they care for, that those children are getting enough service and support. So that we bring a whole nother allied profession to the table to be supportive of early childhood mental health, childhood nutrition, developmental milestones, of course, all of the literacy questions. And then we will be reassessing our system very quickly because early childhood and education and early childhood mental health is central to what I believe has to be done. But also I'm very worried about that gap group that's between like age 6 and 8 that are falling behind on their development. And we're going to be investing in them very heavily also in literacy at that space. That's a space that we've discerned you can get a lot of benefit from helping people in Hawaii because they just didn't have enough support in the early years. And that's probably your last chance to really make sure people don't fall away. And so that's going to be a secondary safety net for us. Not very old children, but in that age group. It's been tested out pretty well in several different places, Los Angeles most recently, and that's a good place to invest also. Although nothing's as good as investing in the earliest ages.
Great, thank you, Josh. I would consider too early literacy, birth to 5 is
Yes.
also a great space to invest.
Yes.
And next up is Erin.
Aloha. Thank you so much for your words today. I have to be honest, much of my questions have been answered and asked by both Justina and Bob. So just would like to highlight once again just the importance of infant mental health in the 0 to 3 years. What are you thinking that you will be able to accomplish maybe in the field, in the age group of 0 to 3? I know we mentioned right just here that 6 to 8 is kind of that secondary time safety net. But if we could really target that 0 to 3, then we might really be able to lessen and reduce that 6 to age group. What specific things do you think that you might be able to accomplish?
Sure. Well, I think the first kind of most straightforward one would be to actually get paid family leave in place. I think if we do that, we will have a lot more capacity for young mothers and young fathers to be home when they need to be with their children, when they have health challenges, or just straight up when they're born. Because we know that the bonding in that first year is just essential in every way. Okay, that's without a doubt. I mean, I know I sound a bit, far left of center. I was born in Woodstock, New York. So that was my upbringing, okay. But that's the way we did it back then, which is commit an incredible amount of family resource in those ages. And so being able to stay home, first and foremost, is important. But also actually to develop the programs and have available services for that age group. A lot of times you can't find it. And you can't find it specifically in rural areas. And, the neighbor islands come to mind. That's where it's so difficult. And I've heard so many stories of people having to either move to Oahu or leave the state if they have a child that is, has increased needs in those early years. And that's really a tragedy. I do expect to build around the school hubs a lot and utilize our public school system as an access point, not just for the kids who start public school right now at kindergarten and go through, through 6th and then through 9 and then through high school, but also using those services as central gathering places where you already are funding facilities and professions, but you have a lot of additional capacity there. That would be the way I would do it. And I've thought about this quite a lot. My intent is to actually have regional community health centers partner with their local public schools and have kind of a seamless system, because then you are setting up the family who already sends probably their older kids to those schools, connected to services for the younger children. It means you have to be a little bit more creative, and that's a good thing. But also we can get a little bit more bang for our buck, if you will, because we have facilities, and a lot of people might already have a dual discipline where they might be an educator at the elementary school level, but have additional desire to provide mental health care for babies or children who are or younger members of that family. Using it as a family hub would be valuable. So that's the way I would start. Keeping in mind, and I want to be sober about this, it is really hard to attract and pay professionals to Hawaii, especially in newer disciplines that we're now committing ourselves to. I don't mean new disciplines as in the professions, I mean adding them to our system. But I will do everything I can to invest. And I will be a very staunch supporter of the public school system and the public health system. So we could probably do a lot better in those areas. That's how I'd go about it.
Great, thank you, Josh. I want to respect your time. It's 1 after 2. Do you have 5 more minutes?
Sure,
for a couple more questions? So Krista, I'm going to have you ask a question, and then there are several questions in the chat that you can take a look. Please take a look at the comments and the questions, and we will continue this conversation during our second round of forums in May and June. Okay, Krista.
Thank you, Carrie. And thank you, first of all, for mentioning Kau as a fellow resident of West Hawaii. Every time that comes up in a state meeting, it helps to center that, if it works in Kau, that takes us much greater distance to having an effective program. And I'm interested in your perspective about the key opportunities in Hawaii, applying our knowledge from the pandemic and using technology to make sure that families who weren't normally reached by our perinatal and early childhood programs are part of that safety net. So I'd love to hear a little bit about your thoughts on that. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. No, that's excellent. So the pandemic did a few things that surprised us and were good, though we really wrestled with a very brutal 2 years. We increased our capacity to telehealth like you can't believe. Less than 1% of all providers across the full spectrum of healthcare providers were willing to do telehealth before the pandemic broke out. By the time we were like 15 months into the pandemic, as many as 50% of our healthcare providers were willing to provide services through telehealth and telehealth, telepsychology, telepsychiatry, and of course, a fair amount of education that was going on, although probably not enough in a very seamless way through technology. So that's one thing which we can do a lot better. And I think that as the generations, I don't want to be rude about this, but as people who are much older who didn't have a comfort level with technology, as they age out of the space of need here, they'll have different needs, of course, as our kupuna and geriatric care. The younger generation is very comfortable and familiar with this kind of thing, right? And so we will need to use that and use it better. I used it to great effect to communicate. And we've had a communication gap for quite some time in some of the executive branches. I'll just be gentle about this, okay? Now, needless to say, I talk all day long. So it shouldn't be difficult for me to communicate need. But I found that if, for instance, we were able to bring a hui of all of the healthcare leaders together in one text chain, I could get all the information within 45 minutes every morning during the pandemic. That made an incredible difference because we could deploy services to the right places at the right time much more efficiently. And a lot of times, as you know, we may only have like a 0.5 FTE available for a region that's spread out across a huge space, especially on Big Island or Maui, Hawaii. So also in the EVA side of this island. So we can actually be much more efficient in our use if we use technology well. It's not a replacement for being close to a person and having that empathetic space to deliver care or education, but the next generation will be able to use tech a lot more. I've already, in fact, begun conversations with Apple and Microsoft to bring some programs to bear for early childhood education. and trauma prevention into our state. And I hope that they will use us. I intend to seal this deal as kind of a test bed for added services with our professionals. A lot of tech for individuals who are struggling and a lot of access to different programs that way. I think we can surmount, we can kind of overcome some of our insurmountable problems that way if we use a tech approach.
Great, thank you, Josh. And I just want to address folks who have put comments in chat. Lehua and Amanda and Nancy and Sherilyn, we will make sure that your comments and your questions are sent over to Josh and his team, and we'll facilitate getting feedback on those questions. So thank you. And with that, I'm going to turn it back to Suma to close us out.
Lieutenant Governor Green, we really appreciate you taking the time to engage in this conversation with us. We hope you found it just as rewarding as we did. For everyone on the call, if you like what you heard and want to learn more about Josh Green's campaign, please go to www.joshgreenforhawaii.com. A quick reminder, we'll be holding another series of talk stories with each of the candidates between now and June. We hope you'll have the opportunity to join us. On behalf of all of us with Commit to Keiki, thank you for joining us. For more information and to stay up to date on Commit to Keiki's happenings, please follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. And please frequent our website, committokeiki.org. Mahalo, and have a great day.